Anti-black racism is real. Unconscious bias is real. And systemic discrimination is real, and they happen here in Canada.
We have our own issues here in Canada, and we can't shy away from the anti-black racism that exists. There's a lot of pain and frustration, but we can channel that pain and frustration into action and into justice.
No one should ever feel unsafe around police officers who must uphold the law for all, or feel unsafe because of the color of their skin.
As Premier of Quebec, I stand in solidarity with the people who denounce racial violence. We must continue to build a society free of racism.
I have absolutely zero, and I repeat, zero tolerance for anyone targeting the Black community or any minority group.
On this side of the border, marches were held over the weekend in cities right across the country. Thousands gathered to protest racism and police brutality from Vancouver to Halifax. The rallies were generally peaceful, though police in Montreal used tear gas and pepper spray against some protesters. 11 people were arrested for breaking and entering, assault, and public mischief. Canadian protesters also raised the case of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, a 29-year-old Toronto woman who fell to her death after family had called police to help them deal with a mental health incident. The Special Investigation Unit is investigating Toronto police conduct in that case. So what can Canadians do to address racism in this country? Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the NDP. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Ms. Capelos.
I do want to ask you a little bit about what's happening with some of the government's announcements, but I wanted to start off with something you touched on in your press conference earlier today, and that is, of course, what we've seen unfold south of the border, and what has sort of been going through, I guess, your mind while you watch all of that unfold and while we talk about the presence of racism in this country as well.
A couple of things. One is that I don't think we can deny how chilling and how painful it was to see the way that casual and callous violence and anti-black racism took the life of George Floyd. Just that the casual and callous nature of that violence is something that is embedded, I think, in our hearts, and something that chills us to our core. And the other part that I think about is the pain and frustration of seeing someone that people can say that looks like me, someone who's racialized, someone who's black, to see their life having no value really makes people feel like they don't have any value. And so there's a lot of pain and frustration. And then here in Canada, we can't just look to the States and say this is an American problem. Anti-black racism is a worldwide problem, and certainly in Canada we've got anti-black racism, there's anti-Indigenous racism, and it has killed and taken the lives of so many people.
What do you think, I guess, where do you think that conversation goes here? And specifically, I know that you talked about some things when it comes to policing, for example. What sort of things should we be focused on where that's concerned?
Well, I don't want to suppose that I have all the answers. It's going to take people coming together to come up with the solutions. But there are some things we can do immediately. One is policing. It's really clear that there needs to be a different approach to policing. And I remember my years working in the criminal justice system as a lawyer. It's very clear that the de-escalation is not giving the attention it needs to have. When there's tension, when there's a conflict, there needs to be more of a focus on police training towards de-escalation. The second thing is racial profiling and discriminatory police practices continue. One of those practices is carding, or someone being profiled and stopped for no other reason than the color of their skin. That happens to Indigenous people, that happens to Black people. And so that type of practice, what it does is it erodes the trust between the public and the police. And so it makes communities less safe. It's less likely someone's going to participate or work with the police when they feel discriminated or even the subject of violence because of the police. So that's problematic. We know the criminal justice system needs reform. The over-policing results in over-incarceration of Black bodies and Indigenous bodies. And we also know that there needs to be, underlying all of this, the inequality which perpetuates the injustice, which allows for the devaluing of Indigenous and Black lives. These core inequalities need to be addressed, which is healthcare, access and outcomes, housing, and access to resources generally.
I was struck yesterday by a few people who reached out to me who had lived through, I don't want to say they're similar, but protests and race-based incidents all the way back to the 1960s, who were saying so sort of incredulous that things are where they are all these years later, that they are watching things unfold on TV that they would have watched 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And I'm wondering from your perspective if that feels frustrating to you and what you see as the key to making sure that we're not in the same place 10 years from now.
I think that frustration is real. Like I hear it from people as well. I feel it as well. Someone pointed out that there seems to be a rise of anti-Black racism, and it's not really a rise. It's just there's more cameras now for capturing the violence that still exists. The anti-Black racism still exists, and there's this feeling of like, how much is it going to take? There's a really palpable frustration and anger about how much and how long this is going on for. And so what I think it's going to take is really, it's not the time to be focusing in on peace, as in to try to de-escalate the anger, but it's let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about justice as a way to de-escalate the anger. People are frustrated for a legitimate reason. Let's talk about justice as a solution. And so that's why I'm calling for some clear solutions around inequality, policing, things that we can do right now. But it's going to take people coming together, and it's going to take an honest effort towards working towards the solutions. We can fight anti-Black racism, we can fight discrimination, but it's going to take a lot of us coming together and no longer allowing for passive bystander as being an option. People have to voice their opposition, stand up when they see something happening. I remember as a kid, being bullied and being hurt, but I remember the one time someone who was considered cool stood up and said, "Hey, don't do that." He effectively said that hate wasn't welcome, that hate would not allow it to take hold. And he, in doing that, saved me from being hurt, saved me from having to face potential physical attack. And I think there's a power in collectively denouncing something, but also a power in collectively allowing no space for hate to grow, but then systemic policy changes that need to happen as well.
We are, of course, talking tonight, having a discussion about the prevalence of racism, not only south of the border, but in this country. Various politicians saying more needs to be done and should be done in this country to address systemic issues of racism. So where should change start in Canada? I want to bring in Mayann Francis. She's the former Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. She joins us from Halifax. Hi there. Great to see you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Bessie.
I wanted to start off and ask you sort of what has been going through your head, not only as you watched, of course, the horrific video and the coverage of that, but also the protest that it sparked and the conversation that it sparked.
Well, first I'd like to say, give my condolences to George Floyd's family for his untimely death and the type of death that that caused him to leave this earth. When I first saw the video, I was quite shaken up by it. First of all, by the attitude of the police officer who was murdering him. Even when George was saying, "I can't breathe," calling on his mother, it seemed that the police officer had his hand in his pocket and had his face looking like he was getting such satisfaction out of what he was doing to George Floyd. And that stayed with me, and it's hard to erase his look from your mind. We have to also understand here in Canada that we too have our issues when it deals with racism. And racism is not just overt racism, it's the systemic discrimination that has affected not only Indigenous people, but African Canadians and other wider communities, people of color. And you have to understand what systemic discrimination does and how it affects everybody. And when you look at systemic discrimination, I think all governments have to look at it, not just the federal government. It has to be provincial government, it has to be municipal government as well. It has affected education. It has affected the healthcare system. It has affected the government itself and the bureaucracy. I mean, in terms of their setting up policies that have had a negative impact on the groups that I just mentioned and many other groups as well. And you have to understand that this is not something that just happened today. This is something that goes all the way back to slavery. And the impact of what it has had on society has been very negative. And it will continue to be so unless people begin to understand that Canada needs to look at what's going on here in this country. Yes, we know what's going on across the border. I used to live in the United States. I was born here in Canada, of course, in Cape Breton, and I am very proud to be a Canadian. In fact, I have dual citizenship. And what I see happening here in Canada is constant denial. We have to stop this denial. Right now, we have our COVID-19, and the COVID-19 has impacted dark races, African Canadians, brown people higher than it has on white population. And you can trace that back to the systemic discrimination. And so this is something that people have to understand and stop this denial that in Canada we don't have issues. We have serious issues. And it's only going to get worse if we don't recognize that we too have to manage what is happening.
Yeah, I wanted to get a sense from you because it's something that people have observed to me over the past while, that there is sort of a tendency, almost a knee-jerk reaction here to say it's them, not us, right? We're not that bad. It's not that bad. What do you think the longer-lasting impacts of that constant denial, as you term it, what do you think the impacts are?
Well, the impact is clear. You see what's happening with the COVID-19. You see what's happened to Indigenous population. You see what's happened in the justice system. You see what's happening with racial profiling. You see how the police have responded to people of color, in particular Black people, in terms of their racial profiling in terms of driving while Black, walking while Black. I mean, these are serious issues, and this constant denial is only going to get worse, make things worse. And if you don't learn your lesson from what's happened to us in the past and currently, what's going on now, it's only going to continue to get worse and worse and worse, and it's going to be making harder for change. And when I wrote my memoir, yes, people say you've been very successful, so you couldn't have hit racism. I said, well, read my memoir and you'll see, even though I am a successful Black woman, you need to see what I went through to get there. Systemic discrimination, overt discrimination, microaggression, unconscious bias, all of that was there. And that's the bottom line in terms of Canada needs to stand up and recognize that we too have our problems.
Based on your experiences, I mean, I know this discussion can go so many different ways, but it's a political show. What advice would you have for governments in a moment like this?
Well, I think all the levels of government have to take the responsibility of understanding the impact racism has had on communities. And they have to understand that if they're going to do something, then they have to really take responsibility for what they're doing and also to be accountable. They have to start looking at how they come up with policies. They even have to look at their own appointments to particular areas. Are they diverse? Yes, we want to make sure we have gender balance, but when you're talking about gender balance, you're talking about gender balance of people of color, Indigenous people as well. So you have to look at these things and be very, very serious. And you need to have a plan that's going to work, as well as a plan where you have to give accountability, you have to have responsibility for it. It's not just say, well, we'll put her in there or him in there, they're of color, and then you put it as I always call it as somebody that you just there to say, oh no, we have so-and-so over here, we can look at this person. No, but what's the effect of having people of different colors in there? So I think this is very important. And when you look back, when I think of when I was in office and I wrote the Royal Prerogative of Mercy for Viola Desmond. We're going all the way back to 1946 when she experienced that racism. And here we are in 2021 talking about systemic discrimination. And are we going to continue on with this systemic discrimination and overt discrimination and the denial that it's not Canada, it's across the border?
That's so interesting that you say that, because other people have reached out to me as well saying They're so frustrated that they were having this conversation 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and they're worried about the possibility that in 10 years we're going to be having the exact same conversation. Even if you look back over the last 10 years, there's instances of police brutality that have led to protests and this kind of discussion, and yet we're back here again. And I'm wondering if you feel a certain level of frustration with that too.
Well, I feel not only frustration, but I feel also a sadness because, you know, Martin Luther King said he may not get to the mountaintop with you when we get that equality. And here's Martin Luther King a long time ago saying that. I'm not 21. Am I going to see and feel that we've finally arrived? I don't necessarily think so, because what's going on now, is this going to be, oh, well, we'll get over this in a couple of days or a couple of months, and then next year, you know, we might have it again. But the bottom line is this could be a great turning point. I'm not saying it is, but it could be. But the bottom line is we have to start looking seriously at our own issues here in this country and doing something positive about it, because think of that next generation. And if you take a look at many of the people who are involved in the protests, a lot of them are of that next generation, which is good. So, but if you go back to the 60s as well and look at the protests that were going on there, it would probably be people of my era. And here I am looking at this again and saying, oh my heavens, here we are again. So the bottom line is, and even government has to take that leadership to make sure that we are moving in the right direction.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Ms. Francis, thank you so much for your time this evening and your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mayann Francis is the former Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. One Liberal MP is reaching out to non-Black Canadians saying that racism is more common than they might expect, and it's time to talk about it. Greg Fergus is the MP for Hull-Aylmer, Quebec, and chair of the Black Caucus. He joins us from the House of Commons foyer. Hi, Mr. Fergus. Good to see you. Wish it were under different circumstances. Thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about these issues.
I wanted to speak with you today because I saw your social media over the weekend, and I saw in particular a video that you put out in which you address sort of non-Black Canadians and how outraged they are at seeing that video. And while, you know, that's understandable, you also go on to point out that you know, for Black Canadians, that isn't something that is so that is way more common than we might think. Why did you think it was important to get that message out?
Well, I think because a lot of people haven't had the opportunity, either it's not in their social network, or they don't see real brutal attacks of racism, as we just saw in the last couple of weeks, whether it is a videotape of Mr. Arbery being gunned down while jogging, or if it was of Christopher Cooper being threatened with institutional violence just for being an African American, and or most dramatically is seeing George Floyd being assassinated by a member of the Minnesota Police. This is for a lot of non-Black Canadians. This is their first real exposure to the brutality of racism. So the purpose of my social media post was to raise that, to use this opportunity for us to have a discussion, and most importantly, for non-Black Canadians to have a discussion as to, you know, what is racism, what is our role in racism, and how we as Canadians can work together.
And you underscored how common it is by using an example from the Hill, right? A meeting that you had a roundtable of sorts with Black staffers on the Hill, and how commonplace racist incidents directed at them were.
Right. I mean, throughout their lives, they've had multiple occasions of having that humiliation of being subjected to racism. Some of them even had physical confrontations. You know, this is, and these are these young women and men who work here on the Hill. These are our success stories. These are the kids who are always involved in their communities, worked hard in school, worked hard in on other activities outside of school, and they're here on the Hill and they're making their contribution, and they're always, working hard, smiling, successful people. But every single one of them have had those humiliating experiences of being subjected to racism.
And what should we take from that, do you think? Like, how should that inform the conversation that takes place in this country as we watch what's unfolding south of the border?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I remember the first, when something racism, when I'm subjected to racist behavior that's directed towards me, I'm always caught with this, like, I just don't understand why somebody would have a problem with the color of my skin. Because I keep on, what do you want me to do about it? And there is nothing I want to do about it. So it's really not my problem. It's the person who's expressing that. It's the person who has that behavior. So I think it's really important that we're all going to have to start having a discussion as to what is it? What are some of the reasons that I need to define the other in that way?
And what do you think about, I guess, from a political perspective, your experience on the Hill, your experience in this role? How commonplace is it for you to face racism?
Not very common at all on the Hill, and thankfully for me, I'm in a privileged position. I'm a member of Parliament. There's a lot of there's a lot of respect which is given by all those who work on the Hill towards me. So I can't say that I've personally felt, but I know that some of my former colleagues have felt that way, or some other folks have had different experiences. But personally, I can't say that happened to me here on the Hill. What has happened off the Hill is sometimes I'm part of delegations, and my colleagues are being introduced, and then when I'm introduced as a member of Parliament, it's always a bit of a surprise. People thought I was maybe the staff, accompanying staff, not that I'm actually a Canadian federal member of Parliament. So that's always just a bit of a it's unfortunate, but those are those little things that we face all the time. Why is it that blacks can't be seen to be political leaders? Why is it that that people have that idea that we couldn't take our place at the in this great august hall that we have here?
And so as we look sort of forward, I guess, for people who are sort of trying to figure out how the conversation should be had in this country, where at this point, at least, we aren't seeing necessarily exactly what was on video, as you point out, what outraged people in the United States, but we know that it's prevalent here. We know that it exists here. Where should we be directing our attention? And for people who are watching, who are saying to themselves, what should I be doing? What should my role in this be? What is your advice to them?
Well, my advice to them is that they just really have to have a conversation, amongst themselves and also with their black friends and relatives. If you really want to, a lot of people say, well, there is no racism in Canada, but if you take a look at the Federal Ombudsman's report to the Canadian Penitentiary Service, points out that blacks are 3 to 4 times disproportionately more are remanded, arrested, arrested and remanded, and jailed than non-blacks. But yet studies have shown that blacks are no more apt to commit a crime than non-blacks. So there is obviously something at work that we get greater attention. The Toronto School Board did a study showing how many more blacks are put into detention, who are called out on behavior, who are expelled, or streamed into lower classes and not into more intellectually challenging classes. What's going on? It's not that there is anything congenital making the relationship between skin color and intelligence. So there has to be some social effect at work, and that requires us to really examine, what are the assumptions that we have. And this can play out not only just for blacks, but for Indigenous peoples, for women, for all minorities and disadvantaged groups. There needs to be a real fundamental rethink.
Well, I have to leave it there, but I really thank you for your time and your perspective this evening, Mr. Fergus.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.